Hello and welcome. This is episode 20 of a podcast Engineer-to-Manager. I'm your host, Oleks Maistrenko. In this podcast, we are diving into the essence of engineering management. We talk about the challenges and the opportunities of engineering management. For this conversation or for this journey, I invite experienced managers from different parts of the world. Today's guest is Pat Kua. Hello, Pat. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm very well. Thanks for very much having me on the podcast.
Yeah, Pat, happy to welcome you on the podcast. So you are a returning guest, the first one. And dear listeners, check out our previous episode from November 2022, which was 1.5 years ago. You'll find a link somewhere here in the description below. There has been some interesting insights during that conversation about 5 archetypes of their managers and why managers cry. I will not explain what is cry. So go and check it out. What is CRY stands for, because it's an abbreviation, and all the managers should practice that CRY on a daily basis.
Very
right?
healthy, very healthy.
Well, I hope we will not cry today, a little bit more of laughing. Pat, just to give some context about you for our listeners. You're keynote speaker, author and a former CTO and chief specialist at N26, which is a fintech banking in Germany, neobank in Germany. You also worked at ThoughtWorks, and you write an excellent newsletter for tech leads and engineering managers to share the news and articles and thoughts about their engineering managers. Is anything correct? Has anything changed in the last 1.5 years?
Yeah, so thank you. I was former sort of CTO and chief scientist at N26, but these days I do training for tech leads and engineering managers. So I run that for private cohorts for different companies, and I coach CTOs and VPs of engineering. And I also launched a personal podcast called Managing Managers as well, to help the middle layer, of which I don't normally focus on. And so that's also been a bit of a change since last we spoke.
Happy that you progress and you have something new, and their podcast is very interesting. So go check it out. It complements this conversation as an additional view, because all the people have different opinions, different experiences, and it helps you in your management journey when you get more information, not less, and it helps you in your actually decision making, right?
Absolutely.
You strive for more information. All right. So before we jump in the conversation with you, because we have some interesting topics to discuss, dear listeners, put this on the post, or click the like button or click the dislike button and tell us in the comments why you're dislike this podcast. It's very interesting for us to get the feedback, and don't forget to subscribe. So back to you, Pat. As we discussed before the podcast, it's interesting to understand some specialities of the local market, specifically when their market is global. We see what's happening on the street, people being laid off, like several days ago Google laid off their Python and Flutter team, for instance. And you live and you're located and you work in Germany. Yes, we're all go online, but let's talk what's going on on the German market. What's the hiring situation in Europe in general from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting aspect to the market, because you could kind of split it into a couple of dimensions. There is probably what you would call a dimension of the market, which is probably a bit more of the startup or VC funded market. And that probably mirrors quite a lot of what you see in the US. And from that sort of side, there's not a lot of investment, or at least there's more careful investment. And for companies who grew really rapidly, particularly either pre-corona or during the corona phase, have probably scaled back, trying to really work out, is this a sustainable business and what makes sense from a sort of long-term cash flow perspective. So I think there's a part of the market that's very similar to that. But at the same time, I think one thing about Europe is that it's perhaps a little bit sometimes more conservative in adopting certain trends, but also that means that they're a bit more resilient to the trends of when things are going down. And so from that sort of perspective, the German economy is, a bit mixed. So there are some dimensions where it's a little bit weaker, but it's got a strong engineering, like a real, not engineering, not as in a software engineering, but mechanical or production engineering.
Like Siemens or Bosch or like
Exactly.
huge companies.
Exactly. And, they also need software people. So I think from that sort of side, they never rapidly grew, is that there's always still talent that's needed to support products because software is pretty much embedded in lots of different dimensions still and continuing to be. And so from that sort of side, there's still a movement in the market, which is obviously people leave and, sometimes those roles do need to be backfilled. But definitely still seeing enough sort of jobs on the market. What I will say is that I think for people listening to this podcast, especially from the management perspective, that's still probably a little bit of a tighter market because most of the roles that are still going, of course, are people who are individual contributors, people who need to build things. And unless teams are really growing, then there's not really that much need for new managers. Unless managers leave. And so then there's a backfilling sort of perspective. So I would say probably from the hiring perspective, individual contributors still very solid, but probably a little bit tougher in the management sort of space.
I see. And there, specifically here in Ukraine, what we see on the market is that the market has changed the direction from from being their candidate or focused. So previously, candidates could choose, there were tons of job, to an opposite direction where companies start to choose and companies start to dictate the rules. And it's always a pendulum, right? It goes back and forth.
Absolutely.
So is the same thing happening in Europe, in Germany, what they observe?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree because, I think particularly it's probably accelerated a lot more because companies are a bit more open to remote work. So I think there is still most companies having some hybrid forms. So, but there are still some companies that are more open to talent in more remote locations because they realize it's a lot more competitive. I would also say the hiring market's a little bit stranger these days because of the acceleration of AI, which I think we'll talk about later. But, you have a lot of tools both on sides of both filtering candidates, but also then applying for roles as well. So I've heard of tools that can sort of automatically spam, lots of job boards and various things like that, which makes a recruiting manager's life a lot harder. But also on the flip side, you also have people who are automatically getting filtered out because of tools used by recruiting managers on the other side. So interesting dynamics these days.
Before we talk about their AI tools, let's talk a little bit about their tech startup community in Berlin, because I know that you're located there.
Yeah.
And they're, from my opinion, when you start a startup or start a company, start a business, it's easier when you're located offline, right? When you meet together with a small group of people and you kick off your ideas or do their whiteboarding sessions.
Yes.
And is it still the case in Berlin? How does the community feel there?
So I would say it's less physically connected than I think it was pre-Corona. Because I think one thing that Corona demonstrated is that teams still were productive doing remote work. I think it also forced this acceptance of more hybrid working. And so what I've noticed with a lot of companies, regardless of what sort of companies they are, is that particularly the tech teams tend to have more hybrid remote working. So it's very rare that I hear of a team. In fact, I don't think I've heard of a team in Berlin, at least, doing full-time work in the office unless people want to actually come into the office, right? So there may be reasons like you don't have enough space at home. When you have young children, it's nice to have a physical separation from work and your day-to-day. And so, those people, there's a bit more flexible sort of arrangements. And I think that definitely has an impact on how much people get together. I think one benefit, though, is the meetup scene is still sort of happening. So I think that's something that after Corona has been a lot more vibrant. So people have been connecting. They can sort of get together. But I will say I used to live in London, and the meetup scene isn't necessarily as active as London, just because you don't have the density. I mean, Berlin is quite popular relative to other sort of places, but it's still not necessarily the same level of density as somewhere like London.
So Berlin is not more a capital of startups in Germany. Is it correct to say?
I would say it's distributed. It's very interesting because there's a bucket of or a pool of startups in, say, Hamburg. And I would say that those startups are probably a little bit more startups who are very centered on the German-speaking market. Berlin tends to be a bit more centered on probably Europe-wide or English-speaking market. And then there's also a whole pool of startups that are maybe more connected to software and hardware in Munich, which is the more mechanical engineering type of hub where you have BMW and I think Mercedes and various things like that. So, there's a hub of that talent there as well. So it's a little bit distributed as well, which is fascinating.
Yeah, you have, I think, Siemens and their Porsche and their Mercedes in Stuttgart, which is,
That's right.
very close to Munich or in the south of Germany, as far as I understand.
Exactly.
Interesting. So it's all the dynamics that changes the market, not as it used to be, very straightforward and very predictable, as I would say.
No, absolutely.
And one of the disruption of the market that you mentioned is AI, that we see different tools popping up. Actually, I had a very nice conversation with Phil Calzado about his tool that he's developing for engineering managers to help them to navigate the knowledge that there is in their team and in the space, in the internet, to make decisions, to keep up their track of what's going on within the team. And you mentioned several other tools for the hiring. So let's start first with the examples of the tools that we know in their EM job. We've mentioned already several. What are the others that you know about, that you tried out?
So I think the majority of what people are using are a lot of the things that help their team. So this is pretty much the Copilot, so the GitHub Copilot. And this is really about sort of accelerating, I guess, the productivity of the team. I think it's interesting because when I talk to a lot of my clients and their organizations, some are a bit mixed here. Now, German market, and I will say a lot of my clients are actually European-wide, so it's not predominantly German, but a lot of companies, like in Germany in particular, have a important focus on data privacy and security. And so that sort of focus means that the companies tend to be a bit more conservative. So, other companies or cultures that are maybe less concerned about that. And I think I'll generalize here and say a lot of the American companies are maybe more willing to just jump straight in without maybe thinking about the consequences. That's something that they're fully embracing, things like GitHub's Copilot to really train and use a lot of those sorts of tools. One trend that I'm definitely noticing, which everyone will probably be using, is using ChatGPT, particularly for engineering managers, as a bit more of a engineering manager pair. So I think one of the challenges for a manager is it can be pretty lonely, right? Is that it's just you by yourself. And so one thing that I am noticing a lot of people are starting to experiment with are using things like ChatGPT, or some sort of conversational AI tool to ask questions for themselves as a way of a bit of meta reflection. I think the interesting side of it is, for me, it's less interesting about the specific tools, but more about the way that people use these tools is not automatically assuming that whatever these tools give you is correct. There's a bit of a sort of sentiment analysis. Is this sensible? Does this make sense? Don't just simply go with it. But it is interesting to see how people are starting to incorporate a lot of that into their sort of day-to-day workflow to ease some of their tasks, right? So as an example, I was talking to an engineering manager and, they had this report that they wanted to have. But of course, when you have a report, you need to think about, okay, how do I communicate this to different audiences? And so one thing that they did was sort of to feed it into a ChatGPT private instance, and then to say, look, I would like an executive summary. I would like a one-pager, and to sort of get different versions of that. Now, they don't just simply use whatever it generates. There's a bit of making sure it makes sense, because I think this is the challenge with a lot of these tools, that the hallucinations or the very confident but inaccurate portions. And so that's an important process of using a lot of these tools, which is not just simply taking what it has as gospel, but really making sure that you validate the output and the outcomes.
Yeah, another thing that I've noticed with our text generation is basically you lose your style. So you're a person, I'm a person, and we write using our own style. Yeah. This may not be English perfect, or we may use some words from our native languages, or you might build something like German-like construction. Yes, we all do prefer to do it like English perfect way, but we all have our own styles.
Yep.
And when you generate, you basically lose your style being substituted with a generic thing. So when I'm generating some text, I read it through and then basically correct it. For instance, some words that I will never use in my life,
Yep.
I can change for something that is my style, right?
Yes.
Yes, this is basically, some people might say, well, Oleks, you're neglecting the broadness of the language. But this is my way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think particularly, if you've been interacting with people, it's a little bit maybe different if it's like the first communication or something that you get from people. But I think you do notice these differences. And when somebody sort of is sending you something, and I notice this sometimes with like emails and, particularly spam emails, I'm like, this is an automatically generated message. Like it doesn't reflect that person, right? So, and then particularly for managers, I think that's important because it breaks trust. And I think that's the aspect, which is, okay, like it shows you're taking a shortcut, which is not a problem, but you're not really thinking about who's receiving it. And that is a really important thing to think about when you communicate, the impact on your relationship with other people, and especially that trust, which you so much rely on as a manager.
Yeah, you should take care personally, right? And show that there is a personality and you think about their engineer or the person that you're communicating with, not just throwing an email. Even for their whole company, when you write as a CEO for the whole company, you have your style.
Yeah.
Either make sure that ChatGPT knows how to, or any tool knows how to copy your style, or do the homework and upgrade the text by hands, right?
Absolutely. Great tip.
Did you include using AI tools in your course, in your studies when you talk with the companies?
I don't focus on using AI yet because I think the tools are what I would say is still early stage. So I think it's a question about how long these tools will be around. And for me, I really try to focus on principles. So I think everyone gets fed up with you see this in the JavaScript world of like the latest and greatest web framework. But ultimately, it's really, for me, I've always focused on the principles and patterns. So the concepts about how to use some of these. And I think we're still in a very early stage here. So, for instance, we don't really have a catalog of how to use AI patterns, right? So I think we're getting a lot of example cases where people are experimenting. And, we're also seeing this in the product space of people trying to integrate AI. But we've not really found like where's the best cases. And, sometimes it's a little bit overcomplicated. Like you don't necessarily need an AI tool. You can go back to just a search engine or something, right? So, I don't really cover it yet because it's not necessarily it's a core thing that everyone is doing yet. And I think it's a little bit, to be determined as to what's the best way to use these. And so I think it's very hard to teach, what's the best way to use these as a general principle. Of course, if you're in and out of using Copilot, you can say, here's the best way to use that. But that knowledge will atrophy very quickly. And that's one of the reasons I don't really cover it as yet.
What I've seen in the software architecture space is that people create these custom GPTs, and basically what they do, they say, look, if you want to create an architecture, you have a set of questions that you have to answer, and you have a template where you can create a reference architecture for your project based on your business requirements. So they put some knowledge, documents, create a custom GPT, and then you just push as a user your business requirements, and their architecture is being generated. Yes, sometimes it's not production ready. You have to tune it by hands, but sometimes it produces very interesting results that you can basically try out and say, okay, well, the work is being sped up. Do you see something like this in the management space, like some patterns, policies, or some approaches?
Probably the closest thing I've seen, and as I said, I think a lot of organizations are a bit more conservative in using this, but the closest thing I've seen is organizations using this to improve knowledge access, because I think everyone knows documentation could always be improved. And so I think that's where I've seen a lot of organizations have some success, which is less about using AI in a management sort of in your workflow, other than like maybe the communication, but really as a tool to help facilitate sort of team or organizational knowledge. So, you've got like pools of wiki confluences and GitHub repositories and markdown files, and having something that can easily digest and make that a bit more accessible. That's definitely something I've seen a couple of organizations use. But you could also say, well, that's just a good search engine, right? So it's just a nice chat interface, perhaps on top of the search engine. But that's how I've seen a few people using it. But as I said, a lot of these things are early stage, I think. And so I don't think we as an industry have yet found here is the best ways of using these tools.
Okay, yeah. Just hear conservatism that already sounded as a word in our conversation. Well, that's fine. That's interesting to see how you see and observe it happening on the European market. That's interesting. And there was there's changes that are happening, and there was basically there are tools and there, let's say, interest, as you mentioned, for individual contributors. Does it make sense for EMs to take a break, think whether they should go back to ICs, or for some just to start learning programming, developing?
Firstly, I think it will really depend on what type of manager you want to be. So we're not going to go into the archetypes, but one of the archetypes that we did talk about in our previous podcast was that tech lead engineering-manager archetype, where you're sort of part-time contributor as well as the manager. Now, if you're managing a large team, let's say 15 people, it probably doesn't make sense to be very hands-on, right? It's going to be just very hard to take care of everything unless you're dealing with an extremely senior team, which most teams aren't these days. They're always a blend of skills typically, or experience.
Yeah, true.
And so some of this is going to be dependent on like what type of manager you want to be, because for some people a lot of the value of the manager is not being hands-on. Now, in some companies there is a lot of pressure to have productive teams, and sometimes if you think about the manager role, it might be okay, well, yes, if you're in a small team of say 2 to 3 people, it makes sense for you to be a lot more hands-on, of course. But then there's a question of like, do you really need a small team of that size, or is it better to hire sort of maybe cheaper individual contributors equipped with AI tools so that they can be a lot more productive, and then you as a manager can help them and work together as a team to produce a lot more. I think there's an interesting pressure because I think a lot of people say, well, managers should be hands-on. I think this is incorrect because I think a lot of people misinterpret hands-on meaning they write code. Now, there's a lot of debate about what does it mean to be technical as a manager. And I'm really of the opinion that your goal as a manager is to make your team a lot more productive. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to write everyone's code for them, because there's no way you could be as productive as a whole team of people. Your goal is to, perhaps be able to review code, right? So that maybe that's the level of technical aspect that you can have. Now, if you think about what is a good characteristic of code, you might say things like, well-named functions, well-modularized, things that are sort of highly cohesive and loosely coupled. Now, those characteristics aren't necessarily language specific. And so from that side, you don't necessarily need to be hands-on to be able to help grow your team and make them a lot more effective. And so I sort of do challenge this idea that, managers need to be hands-on, because I think a lot of people misinterpret that to you need to write code. Yes, I think managers need to understand the work that the team is producing, because you as a manager need to be able to assess risk. You as a manager need to be able to perhaps give direct feedback on that. But also remember, you have other team members who can also do that for you. So I would say it's a bit of an anti-pattern if every line of code needs to be reviewed by you as a manager, right?
I couldn't agree more. And there are characteristics that you mentioned. You can try to measure or check them using existing tools, right?
Yeah.
There is no need to check the way your developer ICs in the team are naming the functions. Is it the camel case or is it the snake case? Because as a manager, have to establish a culture and understanding and agreement within the team
Absolutely.
that we all work this way, right? And then ask your team, okay, guys, we see here and we agree that we work this way. What is the best tool to make sure that we follow this approach that we all agree upon, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So absolutely. And particularly when it comes to style and syntactic preferences, I will describe them as, those things are easily automatable. The harder parts are really when it comes to design choices, because that comes to trade-offs, right? So how do you decide where to maybe put code in one module versus another? It depends on, your situation, what you're optimizing for. And that's where a lot more of that value from the code, code reviews or design architecture reviews should come from. But once again, it doesn't necessarily need to be the manager who's the person who's running all of those activities. Hopefully other people in your team are just as competent at giving feedback about design and architecture and other aspects there as well. And so for me, the role of a manager is changing how a team operates so that it becomes a lot more self-functioning or autonomous over time. And yes, you may need to be a little bit more, hands-on or driving some of those activities, but your goal is to be able to step back at some point in time. I also do want to point out, I think in today's world, a lot of teams are also cross-functional in nature. And so I think there's a drive to be hands-on also puts a sort of impossible burden on a manager in that you cannot be the expert in every set of technology that your team is going to be dealing with, right? So today, if your team is going to have some AI ML people, typically you're going to have some front end, iOS, web, or Android, back end type stuff. I don't know anybody who is truly an expert at all of those different disciplines, right? And so there is a bit of a impossible burden if you expect a person to be hands-on in all of those technologies.
True. And this is basically how the tooling can also help. If you can support, if you can have a tool that supports understanding their architectural decisions that are being made, right? Or not making the choice for you, but rather pointing you out and they're navigating the knowledge base, as you mentioned before.
Yeah.
Yes, this can be a tool to search their knowledge base, but we all know their knowledge is a very broad thing, right? You can put, as you mentioned, in Wikipedia, in Google Documents, and then bring it all together. That can be easily searched, and the links between different documents can be easily established, not by hands, because by hands we all know it fails. You just forget to update the document XYZ that you put 5 months ago when you're writing a new, and the new member arrives, and well come on, that's a burden.
Yeah, and I think one aspect of it is also making sure that whatever is there, so you may not necessarily worry about the structure of the linking, but I think there's a bit of a responsibility for managers to make sure the team is sort of producing content that is up to date and relevant, because it's garbage in, garbage out, right? Is that if you don't have useful things, and I think that's the thing that Wikipedia demonstrates, is it's important to have fresh information, and there does need to be a little bit of motivation that a manager needs to sort of help her team to document things that are relevant and important so they are accessible for future team members.
You mentioned there are a set of technologies that their team typically has, right? And to support the team with even like a code reviewer, which is already quite technical, I think, you will need to be up to date with all those technologies and things that are happening if your team starts to adopt them. And there's some time or IC might come with an idea, let's use our new version of, I don't know, whatever framework is coming out on the market. So what is a good strategy for the manager, whether to evaluate these new technologies or to be up to date with the new technologies? Because these are different things, right?
So a lot of these are actually the things that we covered in building evolutionary architectures, which is really about, helping your team keep up to date with change. And I think this is where the important on teaching architectural principles and design principles still make a lot of sense. So for instance, regardless of what, framework or library you choose and use, some of the things that you probably want to be asking are things like, is this thing like more of a framework or a library, right? Because as a framework, it controls effectively how your code gets called, versus if you're a library, you call that library and it's less decoupled from that sort of perspective. And so, as a library, you can theoretically swap it out a lot easier than a framework, because effectively, if you rewrite something, you have to then rewrite it in a completely new framework. Similarly, if you look at frameworks and libraries, one of the first questions I'd be looking at is how testable is this? Because testability is something that you'd have to think about regardless of if you use it or not. But also, if something's more testable, it often shows that it's well designed and decoupled, in that you can maybe compose different sort of aspects as well. Another sort of aspect that I think is very important is the sort of maintainability, or what's the lifespan of something that you're going to be using, right? So there's this old trope in technology, which is use boring technology. And there's a lot of good reasoning for that, right? I know engineers love to use the newest and greatest, but at the same time, newest and greatest things create a lot of what I would describe as accidental complexity, distractions that your team need to deal with that aren't necessarily needed for whatever feature or work that you're trying to deliver. And, that ends up meaning that your team builds workarounds and spends time debugging things that probably they shouldn't be spending a lot of time doing. And so there's a lot of assessment to particularly assessing new tools and technology for about things like that maturity, about how easy is it to learn, how easy is it to support these things. And also realistically, is this thing going to be around in 5-10 years, right? Because if not, then you have to already start to plan a migration. And this is one of the reasons why you probably as a manager are a bit more conservative than an individual contributor, because you have a bit of a longer term perspective, right? About who's going to be inheriting this code base or system in 10 years time or 5 years time. And, what issues are they going to have? And that changes perhaps some of the decisions that you're going to make.
So there are good news for non-technical managers that there is a framework that you can use to evaluate their technologies that are being proposed by the team, and there is no or little need to learn every new framework or technology that's on the market. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think the thing that is important to focus on is experimenting with new capabilities. And I think this is exactly with and I'll be specific here, with the LLMs or the generative AI type stuff, is I think people are trying to work out what's the best use of that, right? So, and I think that's where it makes sense to be able to experiment, but not to commit to let's build it into the core of our product, which is going to be very hard to change in the future. Is let's test it in an isolated manner, right? In a spike, in a prototype, or maybe on a side project, but let's not build it automatically into a system to sort of see how well that makes sense. And a lot of those principles are the things that we cover in building evolutionary architecture around how you make systems sort of more loosely coupled and more resilient to change over time.
Would you recommend this book for managers or for more technical people?
I think it's anyone who is involved with building software should be reading this book. And so if you're a manager leading a software team, I do think you should know that book. I think the other interesting aspect that a lot of people don't realize is a lot of the aspects to change aren't necessarily just technical aspects. There's sometimes this term that you hear called socio-technocratic, is that's how software works. It's an interaction between people, sort of teams and processes, and the technology. And that's definitely something that is important for managers to understand, is that your processes or team structures can make it a lot harder to make change to software. And there are structures that allow you to make changes a lot easier or harder depending on that. And so I think that's an aspect that we do cover in that book as well.
Nice. So we'll put the link to the book in the description below. I think I saw it on Amazon, right? Or you can get it online.
Yeah. It's on O'Reilly as well, so the platform now. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the recommendation, and it's interesting to see, and I possibly get the version of the book to read it as well. So, Pat, you have the EM Essential Workshop, one of the workshops where you share knowledge with different types of leaders, different technical people across different organizations. And in the EM Essential Workshop, you talk about different things, but what struck me immediately was the managing the system term. And can you elaborate a little bit more? What is the system, and how do you manage it?
Sure. I think a lot of engineering management training that I've seen and experienced tends to focus on people management. And I think it's important, at the same time, I think some people think, well, my role as an engineering manager is to manage people. And I like to go back to Grace Hopper's quote of, you lead people and you manage things. And the thing in this case is really the system of how people work together. And so when I talk about managing the system, I sort of want to help people understand different elements that they need to really manage. So for an example, the relationship between you as an engineering manager and perhaps your product counterparts is a really important partnership. And it can sometimes turn into a dysfunctional relationship where engineering managers see their role as defending their team from product, and that ends up creating a sort of rift in the team and sort of distrust. And that's a really important aspect of managing, which is sort of managing what I describe as a mini co-leadership group within the engineering management or the engineering team. And so that's one element of the system that somebody needs to really sort of worry about. I think there's definitely another aspect, which is, in most companies, unless you're a really small startup, you have other teams and you have other parts of the organization to work with. And so an important part of your role as an engineering manager is working well with the rest of the company. And so this might mean upstream or downstream dependencies. So you might depend on other teams who need to create something for you, or you're creating something that other teams need. And often, even if we think about sort of different departments, everything from, say, sales and marketing all the way down to, say, support and customer services, an engineering manager really needs to make sure that they're keeping all of those elements in check and to make sure that it's harmonious. So I know a lot of people as engineering managers go, well, I have a lot of meetings, and I think a lot of people see them as non-value add. And I want to reframe a lot of that, because I think in order for you to work well with the rest of the organization, you have to meet with other teams and departments. It's not just simply your role is to make sure that your team produce work, but actually that work also needs to work harmoniously with other parts of the system. And so when I talk about the system, I'm sort of thinking more organizationally at a macro level, with the sort of partnership within the sort of team level. And of course, there's definitely the team and the process of how individuals work together. So it's the whole systems thinking thing. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And it's really an engineering manager's role to make sure that it's, a really high performing team versus just a bunch of individuals who happen to be working as a group. So there's a lot of different elements. And I think a lot of people who focus on engineering management often think, yes, I need to focus on people management, which is correct, but it's not the only thing that engineering managers need to really focus on.
You mentioned one interesting topic, which actually comes a lot in different organizations, is when engineers are saying like, well, you are in the meetings all the time and we don't see the value. And the reason for that, there might be multiple reasons, right? Let's talk through them. So the reason is that it's not transparent what you are doing, or there is no immediate result, right? Because it takes some effort to achieve things. But what would be the approach for engineering managers to avoid, in the first place, such attitude? And how to manage that attitude from engineers?
It's a great question. And this is actually a topic that I cover more in my technical leadership workshop. And the sort of subtitle for my technical leadership workshop is Maker to Multiplier. And I think part of this is reframing how you add value. So I think an engineering manager, if they come from an engineering background, they're often trained to think about, my value is through the things that I make or create. And suddenly when you're in a meeting, it's kind of like, well, I'm not making anything, right? I'm talking, I'm discussing. And so there is that, as you said, sort of lack of tangibility, lack of maybe feedback about what I'm actually doing or creating. And I think that's the challenge, is that, if you reframe your role as a manager, as an engineering manager, as a multiplier rather than a maker, your goal there is to really amplify the effectiveness of your team, right? And I think part of this is then asking yourself, okay, are the meetings helping me do that? Am I having useful meetings, right? So you can obviously run terrible meetings, that I've been part of many of them. It's one of the reasons why knowing how to run meetings is really an important aspect of a manager. But it's not just simply attending all types of meetings randomly. It's also sort of saying, okay, well, what are the meetings that help my team be more effective? So, for instance, if I meet with customer services and I understand the things they need to do their job well, and we incorporate that into our, say, development process with things like definition of done, we estimate that work, we produce, really good documentation so that the customer services team can support and train. That should in turn decrease the number of requests on our team, which help multiply the effectiveness of my team in the long term. And I think reframing how you see meetings as is this helping my team and the organization either in the short term or the long term? I think that's a really important aspect of sort of thinking about, are these value add and sort of changing that habit as you talked about.
One thing that might also comes immediately into my mind is that basically sharing with the team why are you going to this meeting or what are you kind of doing, because everybody sees the code in their GitHub repository, everybody sees their tasks in Jira. As a manager, you don't communicate all the time why are you going to that meeting, and kind of I think that was a very good point in the Sarah Drossner's book that I reviewed recently, was to share your progress with the team on a weekly basis. So you say, like, look guys, I did this ABC because we are targeting this, and this will help you or will affect positively the job you're doing.
Yeah, it's a great tip, and it reminds me of one of the very first management books I read, which is not so well known because it was written a long time ago, but by, I think it was Esther Derby and Joanna Rothman, called Behind Closed Doors. So it's a book about management, but it was published by the Pragmatic Programmers, I don't know, like maybe, I'm guessing now, 15 years ago. So it's maybe not in vogue because it's not like called engineering management. But, I think it's interesting because they talk about this, which is a lot of the work that you do as an engineering manager is behind closed doors because you're in meetings. And so by creating a little bit of transparency about why you're having these meetings, about what's going on, and also the impact it has, can definitely help increase trust for the rest of the team and visibility for sure.
This sounds like one of the success criteria for their engineering manager, right? So that the team understands what you are doing and trusts you in whatever you are doing and supports you. You also have this topic as a success criteria for engineering managers in your workshop. What are the other criteria that you have in that list that you share or discuss?
So I want to also just make a fine difference here, because I think there's a difference between a team needing to know what you do and them trusting you. And I actually don't think a team needs to always know about everything that you do, right? So I think as long as you have high trust and the team sees value in what you do, it's a bit like, if I have team members on my team, I don't need to be looking at every single line of code they create as long as I trust them. Of course, to build up that trust, you have to create some transparency. But I do want to differentiate and emphasize that it's important really to build up that trust, but you don't always have to go and talk about all the things that you're doing, because I am guaranteed people on your team will say, particularly some people, they're like, I don't need this level of detail. Right? It's like too much information.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. But to answer your other questions around what makes a successful engineering manager, I think it's interesting because on my podcast with managing managers, I ask, directors and other people, how do you measure success for managers? Everyone has slightly different answers, but there's definitely one sort of interesting theme, which is, firstly, a team's purpose is to deliver value. And so, it's not enough, once again, just to focus on people management of saying, oh, everyone's really growing, everyone's really engaged. But if the team isn't actually delivering results, then, unless you're working for a charity with a lot of money, which most companies or charities aren't, there needs to be a trade of value and time and energy, right? And so firstly, is the team delivering results? And results are a little bit dependent on how your team or your organization works. So it might be about, regular deliveries of things. It might be about shipping product, more perhaps hypotheses and experiments. It really depends on how you run your product organization. But a team is delivering value, right? So I think that's definitely one thing, which is, there's visible progress of something that's subjectively value. I think the second thing is the people management, right? So we know that it's hard to hire and retain really good contributors. Even in a bit more of a tighter market like today, there's still quite a lot of choices, and you want to make sure that people are engaged and growing. And so there's definitely an element of, and this is where the people management comes in, of trying to make sure that people have as many growth opportunities as you can provide them within the environment, and that people have ways to engage with their work. So what people find engaging at work is different from person to person and changes over time. But that's definitely something about, I think one of the reasons why a lot of the agile processes of like team self-selection or people pulling works really well, because it creates more engagement around people sort of finding things that they can work on within the constraints of what your team still need to do, right? Right. It's not just everyone playing around with stuff. And then the third element is really about the sustainability, right? And this means that it's not enough just to have people working on things, shipping things really quickly, but it also needs to be of really good quality. And this is really emphasized, I think, by the great work by the Accelerate book of you have to invest in the right level of quality and make sure that you keep things like dependencies up to date, and you're finding ways to incrementally tackle tech debt and not letting it sort of accumulate to the point where you can't deliver business value anymore. So I think those are generally the three main pillars.
Nice. So basically what you're saying that you have to gather the team, make sure it's a team, not a group. And if you have the team that delivers, then you're successful. Second, that there are elements in the team, there are people, the whole performance of the team, they have to be happy with whatever they're doing and have the progress. And then third is basically on the quality of the first value that you deliver as a team. So make sure you have the process, you have their quality attributes, you have their differentiator between their roadmap that you have and their kind of. This again, managing the system, but putting the system on the team. That's
absolutely, and enough documentation, right? So I think everyone forgets documentation.
Well, you have lots of those aspects in the engineering world, right? You have to make sure that they are all kept up. Yeah, it's interesting. So basically, dear listeners, you can think back about your success, and that gives kind of a framework to see where you can be better. And or where you're lacking something that you can learn and implement in your daily activities. That's interesting. And then a third point from the workshop that I wanted to discuss is that when you're all in your work, when you're successful, when you're work according to these three criteria, sometimes it happens that you are sucked completely into your work life and you don't have the right balance between your team, your work, and your personal. And we often say in the industry that you also have to have a continuous learning, right? So you have to work with a team, have some learning, know some technical stuff, and then in the end of the day, come back to your family or your hobbies and have time and energy for that. So what is your recipe? What do you share, or what do you see in the industry?
So I think some of this is a little bit dependent about how much maybe free time you have and what your personal interests are. So for example, I think a lot of my personal interests are about learning a lot more about sort of people and teams and organizations, which overlap well with this. So when I tend to read in my own personal time, I like reading those books. Some people don't, and that's perfectly fine. So I think understanding that is an important aspect. The second part, I think, is really sort of what I tend to think about how you try to grow people as well, which is really trying to find opportunities within the workplace and your environment to learn on the job, right? So there's so many different opportunities. So concrete example for engineering managers is you're going to be a part of a lot of meetings. And a good example is if you want to learn, say, a skill, learning how to facilitate good meetings, you have a lot of opportunity to practice day to day. And, given ChatGPT, YouTube, all of these different resources, a lot of this is really just about deliberately focusing on a skill at a time and sort of saying, look, I want to get better at facilitation. So I'm coming up into this meeting. What can I do differently to maybe practice some element of that? Similarly, you're going to be in a lot of one-to-ones, and there's lots of great advice about how to run one-to-ones out there. And so, use those opportunities to find ways to practice a little bit about how to improve one-to-ones and experiment with what works and what doesn't work. I think it's also important to perhaps frame things with your team if you're going to try something new, because I know a lot of teams kind of roll their eyes a lot when they're like, oh, I think my manager just read another business book and they just want to do this thing, right? And, it's easy to just sort of say, hey, look, I have read this book. I'm sorry, it's going to be terrible, but I'm trying to learn at the same time, right? And I think it's very human to let people know that. I think that's a hard part about some of the engineering management stuff is you probably don't get as many fail-safe opportunities as maybe an engineer where you can do like a code kata and throw it away, because a lot of the things that you do interact with people. But I think if you think about it a little bit differently, which is like small fail-safe experiments, so, I'll try it with one-to-one this week, right? So maybe that person's one-to-one's terrible. Really sorry, but at least we've tried something, right? And at least trying to find ways to limit the risk is a great way of learning.
Yeah, with the systems, it's sometimes easier. Lots of times easier to try things out compared to people, because with people you also have that velocity and you don't have the immediate feedback, right? And with the system, okay, you have another framework, you run it against their measures. Does it work? Doesn't work? Does it have all the capability that we were hoping for? And with people like, okay, I tried this one-to-one, but the person is, I'm not sure, let's try it again and see. So it's the feedback is much slower, and that makes it trying every week is not that comfortable as it sounds.
You're absolutely right. And I would also say that the feedback is less precise, or it's more subjective, because I think that's the thing when you have a build or a test, it's a yes or no thing, right? Or a deployment, it's a yes or no thing. But I think that's the hard thing with some of these skills is that, like, was it better? It's a bit subjective, right? So some of this is still, I think, trusting the process of, it's a bit like you have to go through the motions of I don't think it's true, but the 10,000 hour thing, right? Of like, you practice a lot and you will eventually get better at it somehow. But trusting the process, I think, is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And even with trust, you cannot measure it really, right? So you can establish some scale, but still it's very undefined on the end. So what is the ultimate trust that you're looking for? And they're in different, it also depends on the company, on the culture, like in different nations it's different, the openness and so on and so forth. One thing that you mentioned about meetings struck me also, that as you're participating as a manager in the meetings, you hear lots of technical things. So there you can also learn about technical aspects that other engineers are talking about that they're using to make sure that you understand them, learn something new, and sometimes, depending on the meeting and the setup of the company, you can challenge them, right? It's kind of, guys, why are we using this framework? Have you checked for other frameworks? And then they go and research for you and bring back the information, for you and for the team, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an interesting way of learning, because I think one of the traps that I've seen with some engineering managers is it's hard for them to say, I'm not the expert. And then, they go off and read something and then they say, what they think is the right answers. And the technical team's like looking at them going, you don't know what you're talking about, right? And that really damages a lot of trust. And I think the best managers, leaders that I've worked with say, look, firstly, I've tried to learn about these things. This is probably what I know about and what I don't know about. So let me know where I'm not right. And, when they are told maybe something is wrong, they learn from that and they take a visible interest. And I think that's the important part about learning about this, is sort of learning about your edge of knowledge and continually pushing that through curiosity. And I think you gain a lot of trust from your technical team members when you demonstrate you care about and you're interested in their work. Some of this is like you have to decide how deep you go, but I think it is important to understand the principles of some of the technical aspects. You don't necessarily need to be the best sort of coder, But once again, focusing and understanding the principles is important so that you can talk about these things appropriately, or you can manage the risk or understand the risks more appropriately.
Yeah, I think it's also important to open up a little bit in front of the team and understand your weaknesses, that you don't know something, accept it, and then go through that phase to learn. And that also brings the level of trust up, because you say, well, I don't understand things. Really? What I will do, I will try this. I might ask stupid questions. Sorry for that. But I'm really trying to be in the context to make sure that I can help you with the velocity, with the value that you're building.
Absolutely. It's that vulnerability, I think. And I think people go, oh, yeah, like you're human too.
Yeah, and that helps a lot. So we shared lots of tips for engineering managers. Well, guys, just while you're listening, just go and try them out. Think about them, or think about your success, your efficiency at work. Think how you learn at work. Think how you balance. Because with the balance, it's indeed lots of people are technical and they are looking for technical things. But if you're not technical, like, I don't know, you're doing some sports and you're a fan of sports and you like to go to the training every evening, that wouldn't work what you're saying, right? They're like reading books and they're going kind of extending your interest out of the office hours.
My personal approach probably won't work for some people, but I know some people, for instance, who like to listen to podcasts while they're maybe on a treadmill or while they're on a bike. And, I think some of this is being a little bit clever about how you use some of that extra time. I do think that there is a certain level of, you have to find a way to continually develop yourself. Mm-hmm. I sort of recommended that you find ways to do it on the job that align well with what you need to do, because that's the thing that you will have, time for and that you can actually start turning into skill. But, there is also dead time that you can normally use in certain times. So, like new parents, for instance, while they have a baby or resting, they're listening to a podcast. Or if you're doing dishes, some people listen to a podcast or various things like that, right? So there's lots of ways to learn, I think. And I think just part of it is being just a little bit cleverer about how you find that time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, dear listeners, just think about it. And there is always an opportunity to learn. I fully agree with Pat. Just take it with care and find that opportunity that would really help you in your day-to-day job. So, Pat, thank you very much for your time and for sharing these great tips and this great conversation. If people want to reach out to you, where do they find you?
Thanks very much for having me. It's been a really great conversation. People can reach out to me on Twitter at Pat Kua. KUA, or the same website, so patkua.com. And you can find my contact details there and all the things that I'm currently up to.
We'll put their contacts in the description below, so dear listeners, just go check out. And I would recommend subscribing to the newsletter from Pat. You're getting them on Sunday evening, like, okay, planning my week. Oh, no, planning is not for today. I just go and read the newsletter and follow the link that you're sharing.
Thank you.
All right, Pat, thank you very much. And it was a great pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Dear listeners, if you haven't done this yet, but I know lots of you haven't subscribed, go and subscribe. This will help to share this great information conversation with a broader public to spread the knowledge and support the channel. Thank you, and talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Cheers.